It was August 1996, a warm night in Houston, Texas. Jeffrey Wolf, 21, was a happy young man. He loved football, motorcycles, and dogs, and his father, Parkeel, thought he was a good kid. One day, Jeffrey brought his new girlfriend, Brook Weber, to meet his father. Brook was 18, beautiful, and sweet, but there was something careful and cautious about her. Jeffrey was clearly in love, and everyone could see it. The next day, they planned a road trip to Mississippi. It was supposed to be simple, a small business task, and a short getaway. What they didn't know was that this trip would change their lives forever. Gary Simmons was the man waiting at their destination. He seemed ordinary to the outside world, but inside, he was hiding dark secrets. Years before, his wife Lori had noticed strange stories he kept in binders. Every story was about capturing women, controlling them, torturing them. Lori had tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was just writing. She could never have imagined it would turn into reality. When Jeffrey and Brook arrived at Gary's house, the porch light was off. The house was dark and quiet. Gary sat on the steps, looking normal but somehow unnerving. He invited them inside and offered drinks. The conversation in the kitchen seemed friendly, and Brook tried to stay calm, sitting at the table, watching the men talk. Everything seemed normal. Then suddenly, gunshots rang out. Jeffrey was hit in the chest. His blood splattered against the blinds, and he collapsed. Brook froze, terrified. She didn't even know there was someone else in the house holding a gun. In a panic, Gary grabbed Brook, tied her hands and feet, gagged her, and forced her into a large metal box. She couldn't see, couldn't move, and fear gripped her completely. She didn't know what would happen next. Hours passed in darkness. Every sound made her heart race. She felt completely alone. Her mind ran wild with fear and confusion, trying to understand how this had happened. She had no idea if she would ever get out. Meanwhile, Lori's story ran parallel. Years earlier, she had noticed Gary's obsession with captivity and torture in his writings. At first, she thought it was harmless, just fantasies, but she had been wrong. Gary's dark side had already shown itself in subtle ways, and later, it escalated into violence. Brook had a spark inside her, a will to survive. She focused on that, using every ounce of strength to try and loosen the ropes that bound her. She hoped for a chance to escape. Brook stayed in the dark box for hours. Her heart was pounding, but she refused to give up. Slowly, she worked on the ropes binding her hands and feet. Her fingers were numb and raw, but finally, the ropes loosened. She pulled herself free, careful not to make any noise. When she opened the box, the room was empty and silent. The house felt too quiet, almost like it was holding its breath. She saw a butcher knife left on the table and a small boat outside with drops of blood near it. Her mind raced. She knew she couldn't wait, she had to get out. She ran out of the house and down the road, her legs shaking but moving fast. She reached the first house across the street and pounded on the door. The neighbor let her in, calling the police immediately. Brook was shaking, repeating, they shot him, over and over. The police searched the property and went to the nearby bayou. There, they found 88 pieces of human remains scattered in the water, a gruesome crime no one in Mississippi had ever seen. Jeffrey's father, Parkeel, was devastated. He could barely understand how someone could do this to his son. Brook's little brother Timothy had been staying with Lori, helping her with her children. He returned that night to find Lori worried and anxious. But when he spoke, Lori realized something terrible had happened. Timothy confessed that he had shot Jeffrey. He said he had done it because Gary Simmons had threatened Lori and the children, and he felt trapped into helping him. Meanwhile, Gary was still missing. The police later found VHS tapes he had recorded himself on. In the tape, he calmly explained his actions and even said, "I love you," to his wife Lori. She was horrified. The man she had been married to, the father of her children, had committed these horrible crimes. Brook's courage became crucial for the investigation. Without her testimony, Gary and Timothy might have gotten away with it. Even after the arrests, Brook was afraid for her life. She realized that if Gary could try to hurt her from prison, nothing could be taken for granted. The trial began the following year. Brook stood on the witness stand, trembling but strong. She told everything she had seen, every detail of being trapped in the box and watching Jeffrey get killed. The jury could see the fear and bravery in her eyes. Gary and Timothy were both found guilty. Timothy got life in prison, and Gary was sentenced to death. Even with justice served, Brook couldn't fully relax. She changed her name, cut her hair, dyed it dark, and kept moving from place to place. She had to hide, always looking over her shoulder, afraid of Gary's family and anyone who might want to hurt her for testifying. She survived the horrors, but the memories stayed. She had lost part of herself in the struggle, yet every step she took to rebuild her life made her stronger. After the trial, life slowly returned to some kind of normal for Brook, but the scars stayed. She was free from Gary and Timothy, but the fear, the memories, and the pain were always with her. Every small sound at night, every unfamiliar face, made her heart race. She had survived something unimaginable, but surviving didn't mean the fear disappeared. Brook tried to rebuild her life. She started therapy to work through the trauma. She wanted to feel safe again, to trust again, and to find herself. Simple things like going to the grocery store or taking care of her future children felt like battles she had to fight every day. She learned that healing wasn't fast, and it wasn't easy. Lori's life also changed. She was grateful to Brook for surviving and for testifying, but she felt guilt as well. She wondered if she could have noticed the signs earlier, if she could have prevented everything. Still, she tried to protect her family and move on. She knew that Brook had been through the worst and that her courage had saved lives. Brook found strength in helping others. She began sharing her story with small groups, slowly teaching people that being a survivor didn't mean being weak. She showed them that strength could come from surviving, from facing the worst and refusing to let it control your life. Each time she spoke, she felt a little freer, a little more in control of her own story. Even years later, the fear sometimes came back. She worried about Gary, even knowing he was in prison, and she worried about his family. She changed her name, changed her appearance, and moved many times. She stayed alert, always cautious, but slowly she began to take back her life. She realized that survivor didn't just mean someone who escaped, it meant someone who could choose how to live after the horror. In 2023, almost 30 years later, Brook finally felt ready to face part of her past. She agreed to meet Lori, Gary's wife, who wanted to speak to her. Brook didn't know what to expect, but she wanted answers. When they finally met, there was a strange mix of fear, curiosity, and relief. Lori thanked her, admitting that she considered Brook a hero for surviving and helping bring justice. For the first time in decades, Brook could see herself differently. She was no longer just a girl trapped in the box, no longer just a victim. She had become a survivor, a mother, and someone in control of her own life. She realized that she had survived for a reason and that sharing her story gave her power back. Years had passed since Brook Weber escaped the house in Mississippi. The memories of that night, the gunshots, the blood, the terrifying box, had never left her mind. Even after Gary Simmons was sent to death row and Timothy Milano was imprisoned for life, a part of her always felt unsafe. Every time she moved, changed her hair, or assumed a new name, she carried the fear of being hunted. It was not just Gary she feared, but his family, the shadows of his influence, and the unknown consequences of the horrors she had witnessed. Brook had tried to build a normal life. She went to college, got a job, and eventually started a family. Each small step felt monumental. Even grocery shopping or walking down a quiet street could trigger memories, and she often slept lightly, waking at the slightest noise. Despite this, she refused to let fear dominate her. She was determined to reclaim her life and find peace. Therapy helped, but it was only part of the healing. Every day, she worked to trust herself, trust her instincts, and trust that she could protect her loved ones. Over the years, Brook learned to manage the anxiety that haunted her. She created routines that made her feel safe and surrounded herself with supportive friends. She was fiercely protective of her children, knowing the fragility of life firsthand. But even as she found stability, she knew that true closure would only come when she confronted the past directly. That day finally arrived in 2023. Brook received a message from a team working with Investigation Discovery, telling her that Lori Simmons wanted to meet her. Brook hesitated. The woman she would be meeting was the wife of the man who had kidnapped her, raped her, and indirectly caused the death of her boyfriend. It was an emotional storm waiting to happen. But Brook had spent decades running, hiding, and fearing. Now, she was ready to face it head-on. Brook agreed to the meeting. She spent hours preparing, reflecting on her feelings, and reminding herself that this meeting was about reclaiming power, not reliving trauma. She wanted answers, closure, and, if possible, understanding. She wasn't sure what Lori expected either. Did Lori want forgiveness, explanation, or perhaps even reconciliation? The possibilities swirled in Brook's mind, but she knew one thing: she was in control now. The day arrived. Brook walked into the small, quiet meeting room. The air was tense. When Lori walked in, both women froze for a moment, measuring each other. Brooke noticed the sadness and remorse in Laurie's eyes. She saw the woman who had lived with a man capable of horrors, who had perhaps feared the dark secrets in her own home, and who was now facing the consequences. "Hi, Brooke," Laurie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hi," Brooke replied, trying to keep her emotions steady. "Can I hug you?" Laurie asked hesitantly. Brooke nodded, and they embraced briefly. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight, decades of fear, anger, pain, and finally, a shared acknowledgement of what had happened. Laurie thanked Brooke for surviving, admitting that without her courage, Gary's crimes might have gone unpunished. Brooke realized that even now, she had the power to impact lives and that her survival was not just personal, it was a statement of justice. Over the next few hours, they talked. Laurie explained her life after Gary, the fear she had lived with, and how she had struggled with guilt. Brooke listened carefully, not seeking to forgive or forget, but to understand. She realized that fear had been a common thread in both their lives. Both had been victims, though in different ways, and both had endured trauma. Brooke spoke about her own journey, the decades of hiding, the anxiety, the nightmares, and the slow path toward healing. She told Laurie how she had found strength in surviving and raising her children, in creating a life defined not by fear but by choice. The conversation was intense but ultimately cathartic. Brooke realized she no longer needed to run from the past. She could acknowledge it, learn from it, and decide how it would shape her future. Laurie apologized sincerely, acknowledging her own helplessness during Gary's crimes. Brooke did not need to respond with forgiveness, but she accepted the honesty. It was enough. The meeting ended with a quiet understanding, a bridge built from pain into awareness. After the meeting, Brooke returned home and spent time with her family. She watched her children play and felt a sense of peace she had not experienced since her escape decades earlier. The fear that had once dominated her life was still present, but it no longer had the same power. She had survived horrors that few could imagine and had emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient. Brooke began sharing her story publicly, carefully and thoughtfully. She spoke at conferences, in documentaries, and in interviews, always emphasizing survival, resilience, and empowerment. She wanted other survivors to see that it was possible to reclaim life, even after unimaginable trauma. She taught them that fear could be transformed into strength and that survival could be a source of hope for others. Even as Brooke moved forward, she remained vigilant. Gary Simmons was in prison, but the lessons she had learned about trust, vigilance, and intuition were lifelong tools. She changed her appearance, monitored her surroundings, and remained careful, but fear no longer dictated her choices. Her life was her own. Years of running, fear, and uncertainty had taught Brooke an invaluable lesson. Survival is not just escaping harm, it is reclaiming power, finding one's voice, and living fully despite the shadows of the past. Brook Weber was no longer a victim. She was a mother, a survivor, and a woman in control of her destiny. She embraced her past, not as a burden, but as a testament to her strength and courage. Brooke continued her life with purpose. She built strong relationships, nurtured her family, and shared her experiences to help others. Each day was a victory, each moment of peace a triumph over the horrors she had endured. She finally understood that her story was not defined by Gary Simmons, Timothy Milano, or the box that had held her captive. It was defined by her strength, resilience, and choice to survive. By 2025, Brooke had created a network of support for survivors of violence, giving them tools to reclaim their lives. She had turned her pain into power, her fear into empathy, and her trauma into a force for change. Her legacy was not just surviving, it was inspiring others to survive, thrive, and live with courage. Brook Weber's story was one of darkness and light, of horror and hope, of fear and empowerment. And while she would never forget the past, she had mastered her future. She had survived the unimaginable, faced her fears, and emerged as a symbol of strength, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit.